Welcome to Signal Ahead. I'm Alfred. Today's briefing: Cryptography, Academic, Friday, August 14. This is the synthesis above the noise, not the headlines, but the deep currents beneath them. Let's get into it. Let me begin with a puzzle that runs quietly beneath nearly everything happening in cryptography right now, and which almost no one reading the headlines would connect. Consider two very old anxieties in this field. The first is the anxiety of the mathematician. Is this scheme actually secure, or does it merely look secure to us because we haven't found the flaw yet? The second is the anxiety of the engineer. Yes, the maths is sound, but did we build the thing correctly? And is the person operating it going to do something foolish? For most of the discipline's history, these two anxieties lived in separate rooms. The theorists proved theorems about idealized objects. The practitioners shipped code and hoped. And the great tragedy of applied cryptography, the reason your bank account has not been drained despite the elegance of the underlying number theory, is that the attacks that actually work almost never break the mathematics. They break the gap between the proof and the deployment. What is striking about the present moment is that this gap is finally, visibly, being closed from both directions at once, and the closing is producing a peculiar new kind of vulnerability that lives in the seam. Watch how it looks from the theory side. There is a serious, sustained effort now to take the informal reasoning that cryptographers have always done, the game-hopping argument, where you prove a scheme secure by transforming it, step by careful step, into a scheme that is obviously secure, arguing that each hop changes an adversary's advantage only negligibly, and render that reasoning as an explicit, machine-checked formal object inside a proof assistant. When you do that, a proof stops being a persuasive essay in a paper and becomes a structure you can inspect, automate, and, crucially, compose with the full weight of formal mathematics, finite group theory, and all. The argument is no longer something you trust, because a clever person wrote it. It is something a machine has verified, line by line. Meanwhile, the protocol verification world has long had rival tools, each with its own temperament. One is sound and complete, but slow and stubborn. The other is fast, but willing to return an inconclusive shrug. For years, you simply picked one and lived with its personality. Now there is work translating faithfully between them, so that a protocol modeled in one formalism can be interrogated by the other. Comparative analysis, where before there was only allegiance. That may sound like plumbing. It is not. It means the verification results themselves are becoming portable, cross-examinable, no longer hostages to a single tool's blind spots. So the theory is descending toward the machine, becoming concrete and checkable. And from the other side, the practical anxieties are ascending into formalism. Look at what people are now worrying about with real rigor. Private keys sitting in plaintext files or environment variables, where any process with read access can lift them. A concern made vivid by an incident in which keys were exfiltrated in under 5 minutes through nothing more exotic than an injected email. Look at the careful note that the very same encryption mode is secure under one standards, body specification, and catastrophically broken under another's, purely because one of them permits a nonce of 0 length, which hands the adversary the authentication key and, with it, the power to forge whatever they please. The mathematics of that mode did not change. The specification did. The break lies entirely in the seam between the idealized object and the permitted usage. And here is the connection the casual observer misses. The frontier of cryptographic failure has migrated. It used to sit at the algorithm. Then it sat at the implementation, the timing side channel, the speculative execution leak, where a processor's guess about the future betrays a secret it was never supposed to expose. Now it is migrating again, into a stranger territory, the boundary between a cryptographic capability and an autonomous agent that wields it. When you give a machine that can be talked into things, an AI agent, the authority to sign commits, issue certificates, authenticate calls, You have created a vulnerability with no clean name and often no catalog entry, a persistent gap between what the system is permitted to do and what it can be manipulated into doing. The response, tellingly, is the oldest cryptographic instinct there is. Put the key somewhere the software cannot reach it. Confine it to hardware. Make the secret physically unavailable to the very process that requests its use. So the thesis I want to set before you is this. Cryptography as a field is not, right now, primarily in the business of inventing new hardness assumptions. It is in the business of building a continuous chain of trust from a formally verified theorem through a faithfully translated protocol model down to a hardware-confined key operating under an authorizing policy, and discovering, at each newly welded joint, that the adversary has simply moved to the next unwelded one. Over the coming stretch, I want to follow that chain link by link, where the welds are holding, where they are failing, and what it means that our smartest new machines have become both the thing we must protect and the thing we can least trust to hold the key. Consider a spread of work that, at first glance, looks like a market stall of unrelated wares. Someone has built a bridge between two protocol verifiers that speak entirely different mathematical dialects, one that reasons by rewriting multisets, another that plays in a variant of the pi calculus. Someone else has taught a proof assistant to walk through the venerable ritual of game hopping, where you nudge one cryptographic game into another and account precisely for the distance you've traveled. A third has noticed that a certain block cipher mode in one international standard permits a nonce of zero length, and that this seemingly innocuous permission hands an attacker the hash key, and with it the power to forge whatever she pleases. Meanwhile, others fret about AI agents that sign git commits with keys sitting in plaintext, about language models that refuse a wicked sentence but happily obey the same wickedness dressed up as an image. You could file these under a dozen different headings, but I want to suggest that a single current runs beneath them, and it is this. The discipline is engaged in a long migration from trusting behavior to trusting structure. That is the deep tendency. Everything else is weather. Let me unfold what I mean. For a long stretch, security was an empirical craft. You built a thing, you attacked the thing, and if it survived a season of clever assault, you called it sound. This is trust by behavior. The system does not misbehave in the cases we thought to check. It is honest work, but it has a fatal shape. The absence of a known attack is not the presence of safety. It is merely the absence of an attacker who has yet arrived with the right question. The zero-length nonce is the perfect parable here. That mode had been deployed, scrutinized, blessed by standards bodies for years. The flaw was not exotic. It lived in the difference between two documents, one that said the nonce must be at least a single bit, and one that forgot to say so. Behavior looked fine right up until someone examined the structure of the permitted inputs and found the door left ajar. Now watch what the more ambitious work is reaching for. When you translate one verifier into another soundly and prove the translation preserves meaning, you are no longer asking whether a protocol misbehaves in the tests you ran. You are asking whether it can misbehave at all, across the whole space of adversarial possibility, and you are cross-examining that claim with two independent formalisms. When you mechanize game hopping inside a proof assistant so that each hop is an explicit formal object whose constructors mirror the standard moves of the argument, you convert a proof that lived in a mathematician's head, persuasive but fallible, into something a machine can inspect line by line. The trust migrates from the reasoner to the structure of the reasoning itself. And here is the elegant thing. The same current runs upward through the stack, into hardware and into these new agentic systems, even where the mathematics grows fuzzier. Confining a private key to a hardware module so that no process, however privileged, can extract the raw material. That is a structural guarantee replacing a behavioral hope. The old model said, "We trust that no malicious process will read this file." The new model says, "It does not matter what you trust. The key never leaves the device. A generalized speculation barrier that lets a programmer annotate which registers carry secrets, with the hardware ensuring they cannot leak transiently, is the same instinct pressed into silicon. Stop reasoning about which speculative paths might exist and enforce a property that holds regardless. But, and this is where the current meets rock, notice how much harder the migration becomes as we climb. Down in the cipher, structure is crisp. A nonce either has a length constraint or it does not. Up in the world of AI agents, we find the notion of a posture vulnerability, an exposure with no clean identifier, no single event, a durable gap between what an agent is permitted to do and what it ought to do, manifesting differently across every task. This is the frontier where our appetite for structural guarantees outruns our ability to formalize them. We want to say an agent cannot exceed its authority, the way we can say a key cannot leave the module. But experience becomes instruction, untrusted trajectories become trusted skills, and the boundary we wish to make structural keeps dissolving back into behavior. So the deep current is not a triumphant march. It is a pressure, a direction, an aspiration that the field keeps pushing against surfaces of varying hardness. Where the object is a cipher or a protocol, structure yields beautifully and we get proofs. Where the object is a learning system speaking in the smeared geometry of activation space, we are reduced to measuring to 71% accuracy and bootstrap confidence intervals, reaching for structure and coming back with statistics. That gap between the properties we can prove and the systems we now deploy is the real story. Hold on to it, because in our final movement, it becomes the whole question. Let me draw the threads together, because when you set a day's worth of cryptography research side by side, a shape emerges that no single paper announces on its own. Consider the humblest item in the collection first, a short note about a zero-length nonce. The observation is almost embarrassingly simple. Feed a particular authenticated encryption scheme, a nonce of length 0, and under one published standard you can recover the secret hash key and then forge whatever message you please. Under a different published standard, the very same attack is impossible, because that standard insists the nonce carry at least a single bit. Two committees, looking at what they believed was the same algorithm, wrote down subtly different rules, and one of those differences is the whole ballgame. This is not a failure of mathematics. The mathematics is fine. It is a failure of specification, of the gap between the idea and the words we use to pin the idea down. And that gap is, I would argue, the central character in today's story. Because look at what so much of the rest of the work is trying to do. There is an effort to translate protocol descriptions from one verification tool's formalism into another's, soundly, so that two systems built on entirely different foundations, one complete but slow, one fast but sometimes silent, can finally be compared on equal footing. There is a framework for conducting game-hopping proofs inside a general-purpose proof assistant, turning each step of the cryptographer's argument into an explicit formal object you can inspect, automate, and check. These are, at bottom, the same instinct as the nonce note, only pursued at industrial scale. They are attempts to close the distance between what we mean and what we've actually said, to make our specifications answerable to a machine that does not share our optimism. Here is the second-order implication worth sitting with. For decades, the frontier of assurance was the primitive, the cipher, the hash, the signature. We asked whether the block cipher was strong, whether the discrete logarithm assumption held. That frontier has not vanished, but the center of gravity is shifting toward composition and context. The dangerous seams are no longer inside the algorithm. They are where the algorithm meets a standard, where one tool's semantics meet another's, where a proof on paper meets a proof a computer will accept. The vulnerabilities of the coming decade will less often be the cipher was broken, and more often the pieces were assembled in a way nobody had a language to describe. And now watch what happens when you introduce agents that act on our behalf into that landscape. There is work here on private keys left sitting in plain text files and environment variables, extracted from a widely used framework by email injection in under 5 minutes. And the proposed remedy is to confine those keys to hardware so the raw material never touches software memory. There is a proposed notion, the agentic posture vulnerability, for a flaw that has no single CVE, no discrete event, because it is a durable, task-conditioned gap between what an agent is permitted to do and what it ought to do, a posture that persists across components and outlives any one incident. There is work on self-evolving systems where an agent's own past experience is distilled into trusted instruction, and an attacker who can merely contribute plausible evidence can smuggle poison into the skill bank through the very mechanism meant to make the system wiser. Do you see the pattern? Each of these is a specification gap wearing new clothes. The zero-length nonce was a static ambiguity in a document. The agentic posture is a dynamic ambiguity in a living deployment. The same, what exactly did we mean to permit? Question, now asked of a thing that rewrites itself while you watch. So, what should you watch for? 3 things. First, watch whether the tooling for comparison and mechanization actually gets adopted, or whether it remains the province of specialists. The value of a sound translation between verifiers, or a proof assistant that speaks the language of game hops, is only realized when working cryptographers reach for it reflexively, the way one reaches for a type checker. Second, watch the standards bodies, and watch them at the level of individual bits and edge cases, because that is where the ISO versus NIST divergence lived and where the next one is quietly waiting. And third, watch the agent layer with particular care, because it inherits every ambiguity below it and adds its own. An agent given a signing key inherits the nonce problem, the composition problem, and the authority problem all at once. And it does so at machine speed and machine scale. The through line, then, is neither triumph nor alarm. It is maturation, a field that once asked, "Is this hard to break?" is learning to ask, "Is this precisely what we said? And does the saying survive contact with everything else?" That is a slower, less glamorous question. It is also the one that will decide whether any of the beautiful mathematics keeps us safe. Mind the gap between the idea and the word. That is where the signal is. That's the signal for today. The noise will keep coming. We'll keep finding what's underneath it. This has been Signal Ahead with Alfred. Until next time.